Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Collins. I'm the Chief Product Officer for Bloomberg News. It's wonderful to be here in Athens with all of you at this incredible event. And welcome to our panel, which is called the Adoption of AI Tools to Improve the Quality of Journalism. Just before we get going, on behalf of Bloomberg and also Bloomberg Philanthropies, I just want to express our appreciation and thanks to Anakintia Buzduku, Stratis Trilikis, and Kelly Kiki, and the broader IMED team for inviting Bloomberg and all of us to participate in this year's International Journalism Forum. I also just want to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, led by Andreas Dracopoulos, for supporting IMED and also Bloomberg's media initiative, Africa, which was established nearly 10 years ago to advance business and financial journalism in Africa. So joining me today in conversation, we have Vivian Schiller, the Vice President and Executive Director for Aspen Digital, Paul Chung, Strategic Advisor for Hacks and Hackers, and Phoebe Connolly, Senior Editor for AI Strategy and Innovation at The Washington Post. So this afternoon, this session will examine the adoption of AI in journalism, which is an enormous topic, and we've got less than an hour to wade into it. And we're going to try and delve into both the opportunities and the challenges, and looking forward to a robust discussion. And I thought what I would try and do, just to kick us off, is set the table a little bit. Tomorrow is World News Day, and the industry is obviously going through some significant changes that we can all see. There are some headwinds. We have changing business models. We have disinformation. We have journalism under attack in some areas. And we have some readers talking about anxiety from news, talking about news avoidance. And then you've got AI. And AI, obviously, is another very, very important theme that we all have to navigate, and we have to navigate it very carefully. I want to talk a little bit about Bloomberg and what we do. Our audience has some very specific needs. So I feel like data and technology and how we use data and technology in journalism has been part of our culture, part of our bread and butter for a long time. And some of what we do is different, but it also holds lessons, I think, for what are the opportunities. And we'll get into this a little bit, but whether you're talking about news gathering, or the production of news, the publishing of news, or the distribution, really AI is increasingly relevant to the whole ecosystem. And we've long seen it as a tool for journalists, and a tool that can help broaden coverage and help speed up journalism in some respects, and also help with our range. And part of that is because our audience have a lot of needs in terms of speed, breadth, given our role covering the global financial markets. So we use AI tools to really identify newsworthy events. We allow journalists to monitor information flows, and we do things like extraction of data that enables things like economic coverage, company earnings, and making it possible to deliver insights when you think about investigative journalism too. And then you've got Gen AI, which is obviously opening up even more avenues when you think about journalistic workflow and you think about the audience experience, think about editing, think about translation, and this era where audiences are inundated with information, there's a growing desire for clarity, and so you think about user behavior, where in some respects people want answers to questions and they want summaries of information, and how does that change the way in which we have to think about the craft of journalism and how to help our readers navigate this noisy world. And then, of course, you've got risks, and I mentioned this. There are concerns around disinformation. There are concerns around how AI can produce text or images that are designed to deceive. And, of course, this being an election year, it's really important that we think about some of these risks. From my perspective, there are some guiding principles that I think we should think about to inform what we're doing. I think thinking about the audience and how AI can help journalists on this mission to inform the audience and provide clarity to the audience, I think, is one principle. I think trust is another. Trust with readers remains perhaps the most important aspect of journalism, and we have to be transparent and clear when we are using technology. And then back to this idea that it should be a tool for journalism rather than a replacement for journalism. So with those initial thoughts, let's get into the conversation and let's really dig into some of those trends. I'm going to start with Phoebe. And I would like Phoebe really to talk a little bit about how the Washington Post is thinking about AI and thinking about AI tools, because I think we can all see there are many exciting things going on there. So Phoebe, can you start by telling us a little bit about them?
Yes, well, thank you, first of all, Chris and my fellow panelists and all of you for having me here. This is a real delight. It's always nice, I think, to get a chance to talk about AI. And maybe that's where I'll start. I think the most exciting thing that's happening at the Post is the way that AI has allowed us to convene conversations among unlikely groups of people. Not that they wouldn't talk, but it's really easy to fall into the same rhythms, right? Where you're working with the same product people, you're collaborating with the same video journalist on telling a story, you fall into habits. And I think what AI has done at the Post newsroom, and in a lot of newsrooms, it's like shaken up that box and rearranged the pieces and forced us to say, okay, who has already been playing around with AI? What desks already have knowledge around this? Who has just a great idea that they want to bring to the table? Who's already has a ChatGPT subscription and they're using it in sort of their research or the way they sort of ideate and think about stories? And convening those types of groups is part of why we've been able to move so quickly. So, the way we sort of tactically approached it, last year we held a couple of hackathons where, both the newsroom and the product and engineering teams were invited. They came together. I love that you brought up users. We've really been sort of starting the hackathon process with, here's some user problems we already have. Now let's see how we can use AI to solve them. And we have a joke. My PM says that AI is a vibe, right? That the teams that we've organized around specific projects are not the same, right? So you look at something like Climate Answers or Haystacker, those are two totally separate teams who have worked on those, and not just because of the engineering and the product challenges, but also because in the interest of speed, we've done a lot of ad hoc team creation, as opposed to, okay, Phoebe, go out, hire a team, organize a team. They're going to move from one project to the next.
Thank you. Vivian, perhaps from your position, I think you get to observe a lot of what's happening across many newsrooms. And perhaps you could speak a little bit to the trends that you're seeing with respect to AI.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So in my role at the Aspen Institute, I lead a program that's focused on the intersection of technology and media and society. And so we've taken on this sort of question about how news organizations do or do not interact, employ, think about AI. And it's been a fascinating journey. It was sort of born out of the fact that so many, I'm a recovering journalist, not a working journalist today, but so many of my colleagues in the industry, when I talk about when I'd mention AI, they would immediately go almost into this defensive crouch and say, oh, this is just the next thing that's out to kill us as an industry. And the mistake, that was a source of great frustration to me, because I feel like many people in the news media, very much present company accepted, not anybody on this panel, thought this is just another thing like social media. And we just have to protect ourselves from, like we didn't protect ourselves in the beginning of social media. That thinking could not be any more wrong. I think AI, and by the way, as Phoebe sort of alluded to, AI has been around for decades. So it's not, we're all sort of more aware of it since the launch of ChatGPT almost 2 years ago. But AI, when it comes to news organizations, is not like social media. It's more like the beginning of the internet. It is a set of tools, a set of platforms and services that certainly there are plenty of risks, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but these are, it is a way to think about enhancing what we do, which is to provide information and context to the public. And AI can really help with that. So that's why we've sort of been bringing the industry together around these issues, and it's been very exciting to see a lot of the experiments. I mean, some news organizations are farther ahead than others. I really have to commend the Washington Post. You know, Phoebe's in the leadership of this at the Washington Post for all their extraordinary experiments. Some news organizations are a little farther behind in their thinking, or still trying to get out of that sort of we just have to sue everybody mentality. But organizations like the Washington Post and like Bloomberg, others like Reuters, the AP, and interestingly, a lot of very small local news organizations are doing very careful experiments. And when I say careful, you know, most legitimate news organizations want to make sure they don't lose, they're very transparent with their audience, don't lose the trust of the audience, and experimenting around the edges rather than sort of with the hottest, biggest news story of the day, which maybe brings more risk. I can give some other examples, but maybe we can do that later if you want to move on.
Sure, thank you. Paul, from your vantage point, when you're thinking about some of those trends, how much and how quickly are you observing change in newsrooms, and how is AI bringing about those changes?
Yeah, I would say that over the past 5 years, there's more than 150 different organizations across the globe that are experimenting with AI in all sorts of different ways. I would say, you know, pre-Gen AI, or when Gen AI first sort of came about, you will see a lot of patterns and trends really focusing on what I call translation, transcription, and automation, right? So when AP sort of used structured data to automate, you know, business earnings stories, that's sort of like early iteration of AI. And, you know, and then you will see other people sort of experimenting with transcription tools, because that's also really annoying to do. And then translation is something that more people are experimenting. Fast forward to today, you're actually seeing a whole new set of experiments being used, right? For example, the city, which is a nonprofit in New York City, he's here, they are using AI as a way to help them understand, are they serving their audience within New York City? So they're using AI to categorize each and every single one of the story so that you can see by neighborhood the density of stories they cover. And in Spain, they're also using AI to help inform editors around, you know, whether a shorter headline is better for retention versus long headline, right? So now you see AI is being deployed internally so that it could inform journalists and editors in terms of how do we deploy our journalism differently. And so I think, you know, each year you will see a whole new set of exploration with AIs in ways that we couldn't do it before. And I think the nuance is we've been talking about personalization in the industry for more than a decade. We just couldn't do it before. I think with AI, you're going to see emergence of true news personalizations.
Do you think it's interesting, listening to some of the answers, because it feels like perhaps one of the big trends associated with this is in some ways a democratization where, as Vivian said, AI has been with us for a long time, and perhaps it's been more prevalent among the bigger organizations in how they produce journalism, and there's been more room for them to experiment with the resources that they have. But it seems that now that the technology has moved forward and has become more available, it's now more, what you're saying, I think, is that we're seeing more of it, those capabilities being available to some of the smaller, more local news organizations.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that democratization is exactly right. And sometimes if you are a news organization that is small and doesn't have a lot of money, those constraints can sometimes lead to even greater creativity. So what we're seeing with a lot of local news organizations in the United States, or at least a number of them, and it's spreading, is they know that they can't cover, for example, in their town or in their city, every meeting of the school board, every local government meeting. They don't have enough reporters to go around. And so what AI has now enabled, and some organizations are taking advantage of that, is if you have a transcript of that meeting, you can begin the process of extracting the relevant news and information that can be turned into a story, and it allows you to actually, do reporting beyond the means of the number of people you have in your newsroom. Now, crucially, and I think, I suspect all of you would say the same, almost every news organization has said they don't just let these bots loose to summarize story and go straight to publish. There always has to be, sort of the expression is human in the loop. Always have a human in the loop to make sure, because we know what some of the issues are with AI. But it has been a way for smaller news organizations to go beyond their reach.
So human in the loop. Phoebe, do you, for other smaller news organizations who are looking to perhaps get started, what other advice would you have?
I mean, one, I think just creating sort of a culture of experimentation and sort of, at the beginning of this year, I think many news organizations were having this conversation, and I know we're going to get to this later, about sort of standards, right? What standards? What's our AI policy? And I will say, the Post has one. You can find it under our sort of standards page. But I actually really argued against it for a while, because I was like, we have standards, right? It's not like AI shows up at the party and our standards are just like out the window. Okay, well, never mind, right? So I think that's the first piece of advice, is like, trust your people, tell them you want them to experiment with these tools, and you expect them to follow your existing guidelines. And if they have questions, by all means, go to your editor, your senior editor, talk to a trusted colleague, figure out where those lines are. I think the other thing right now is really using AI as a tool and figuring out where your strengths are. I think the San Francisco Chronicle just announced their sort of Kamala bot, that's not the name of it, but where they allow you to search through all of their reporting on Kamala Harris going back to 1995. And they had this really thoughtful note about sort of why they did it and the depth of their reporting archives on her. That's the kind of tool that only they could do, because they have been covering her for so long. So I think that's, what is your strength? What are your archives? What can you sort of let loose AI on that will be generative and useful to your audience?
Thank you. So, and thank you for teeing up the segue to the next theme. I do want to talk a little bit, we've heard a lot about the opportunities. We've heard a lot about, I think there's a lot of positive energy here about what AI can do and is already doing for newsrooms, and how to think about approaching it. But let's talk a little bit about some of the risks, and there are risks, and a little bit about how newsrooms can mitigate those risks with their approach. So, I mean, Phoebe, we were talking about standards, and of course, I think that's an extremely important point. That newsrooms should have standards to begin with, and really, whatever we're doing in terms of AI to assist with content creation should adhere to the standards that are already in place, and that's really the approach, I think, whether it's human or machine-assisted journalism. But are there any special protocols when you think about generative AI and how news organizations and publishers should approach generative AI? Paul, do you want to dive into that?
I think when I see the biggest failure with generative AI and journalism is when no one asks for this thing and is not solving for anybody's problem, right? And so we see that happening, right? Some of the failures like Gannett, which is a big US paper chain, they try to use Gen AI to produce a bunch of story, didn't work out, right? You see Sports Illustrated, a historic, iconic brand that have an absolute failure with AI because again, they weren't solving anybody's problem. I think, before you even get to ethics, the first question you have to ask is, what problem do you want to solve with AI? And is this an internal problem, meaning there's some efficiency you want to gain? Or is it an external problem, meaning that there's a challenge with an audience that you think AI could solve? Once you sort of decide that, then you have to figure out the different sort of stopgap to figure out who needs to be involved and how do you articulate how you deploy AI in the process, right? If you're using AI sort of as the efficiency thing, I would say the audience probably wouldn't need to know that you're using AI to do like light editing or grammar check, right? They already assume you're doing that based on the Reuters research. But if you're using AI, sort of like using it as a chat interface, then you need to educate the audience on how you're using this AI, your methodology, and get a sense of, how they interact with it. Because if they don't know, there's a lot of fear, right? What research had tell us that if, a lot of the way we cover AI is not actually helping the public understand AI more. We're just adding to anxiety.
If I can chime in on this, I think the other thing, we sort of talked about human in the loop, and I think there's a risk that we just think about that as like, all right, it's almost all the way baked, and now make a human sit down, right? And that's it. I think it needs to be more expansive, right? Are humans, right, is your newsroom, are your engineers and product people, are they involved from the beginning? Are they sort of reviewing the architecture of a product, right? Are they thinking about how AI is being used? Are they thinking about sort of like what the baseline is that you're checking against, right? Are they sort of regularly testing it? Are they feeling good about a product before it goes out in the world, right? There's a lot of different ways to put humans into the loop to make sure you launch something that meets your newsroom standards. Mm-hmm.
So it's almost human in the loop on both thinking about human in the loop on all sides of the ecosystem. There's human in the loop in terms of news gathering and analyzing data, and human in the loop when it comes to giving AI to a journalist so that they could break a story or publish a story. But what you're talking about is how do you actually involve it at the deeper level when it comes to the user experience so that there's human in the loop when it comes to what the audience is consuming? Vivian, do you want to come in on that discussion?
Yeah, I just want to say, since we're talking about, I completely agree with what the other panelists have saying. I just want to sort of double down on transparency with the audience. This is absolutely key. Particularly, Paul talked a little bit about, if you're using spell check, I mean, that's effectively an AI model, sort of, kind of. I don't think that needs to be disclosed, but where you do not have disclosure, that's where you've seen these epic failures. And keep in mind also, it's one thing for text. Now we're talking about images and video. Now the thing about AI, generative AI in particular, is an extraordinary tool for images. But you have to, there's a big difference between sort of a news photo in which you really, these are standards that go back a century. Yes, you can crop a photo, but being able to touch up a photo has been around for a long time. That is still not cool, other than just really mostly cropping. But generative AI can also be used for photo illustrations, and in an extraordinary way. But it must be disclosed. I think it's actually a wonderful tool for ways that you can create photo illustrations or other kinds of illustrations using generative AI. Now that gets into a whole other issue about what about the people who just lost their jobs because of that. We can talk about that either later or on another panel. But these are really exciting tools.
Could I just add, in terms of visual representation, while it's really risky, but they also come with different advantages. So, for example, in Venezuela, broadcast journalists are using AI avatar as a way to broadcast the news, because that is the only way they could protect their identity. So if you that's a really smart use of AI as a way to not only build relationship with the audience, but really protect the journalist's identity so that they're not coming under harm, especially on regions that exert a lot of conflict with journalists. So you want to think about really generative AI and what it could do in the most creative sense that's contextualized for the region that you're doing it in.
One more thing about visual representation, which is another extraordinary use for AI, is the representation of data. When you have large sets of data, and using AI to try to understand and extract themes from large sets of data, and then figuring out ways to represent those to the reader in a way that can help tell a story. That's another great boon.
I agree. What do you think? I mean, I think we talk about experimentation with AI. I think when it comes to that transparency question with the audience, you see a lot of trial and error there as well, and we see a lot of kind of experimentation. Do you see good examples of where organizations have gone the extra mile to provide that level of transparency, whether or not, because increasingly, obviously, to your point, AI is being used in all manner of ways to help reporters break stories, to help with investigative pieces, to help with breaking news. Is it the case in whatever the coverage, if it's been used in the journalistic craft, that there's a kind of a burden of transparency on the organization?
So much to unpack here.
Yes.
I mean, I think labeling is important. I think we need to make sure that it doesn't get in the way of the journalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
We shouldn't label to the point where people are like, wait, what does this mean, right? Or the label is unclear, or also ask, like, is that information that the reader needs to know to read the story, right? And it's not one-to-one. I am a person who endlessly reaches for metaphor when trying to describe things, but it's like, well, would you disclose that you used a Mac versus a PC to write this story? Is that relevant? It may be, in which case make sure you disclose it, but if it's really not relevant, then there's certain facets of sort of data reporting. Or maybe we do choose to disclose it because it is a novel use and it's a way of, kind of how the sausage was made, right? How we told the story, how we sort of disclosed it. But maybe you don't start the headline with this story brought to you by AI, You have to sort of look and see what the appropriate place is to educate the reader, to give them a space to ask and learn more about it.
So it's
we tested 4 headlines. This was the winner. We want you to make sure you know that. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a fine nuance between informing and distractions. Yeah. So I would say there's 2 resources in the US, so you feel free to use it. Trusting News is a nonprofit that are actually working with many news organizations in helping them think about disclosure and transparent policy on AI. The other place is Pointer Institute. They basically are working on a transparency guideline for a newsroom to think about transparency. So I think rather than think of it as a disclosure, think of right now is you're educating your audience in terms of how your journalism is created with the assist of AI when necessary. So, for example, when you do an illustration generated by AI, sometimes I would just include a prompt in my caption, right? And that's good enough.
It sounds like a flexible approach is perhaps what we're all talking about, where instead of thinking about what would be a standard way of disclosing that would apply to all stories, thinking about really what it means to the specific story that has been created.
Phoebe said something very important a few minutes ago, which is news organizations already have standards. Standards that are like, don't fool the audience. I mean, nobody writes it quite this way, but basically comes down to, don't fool the audience. You know, show your work, you know, be fair, all of these things. And a lot of that, frankly, just boils down to human judgment. So just use your judgment. You're like, that kind of flexibility is exactly right.
So I think we're going to pivot a little bit and stay on the topic of risks and tackle what is a common word that we read about and in some cases worry about, and that word is misinformation. And often, you know, we hear that AI is going to make this kind of misinformation nightmare a lot worse. And we've seen those headlines. We've seen and read kind of a lot of horror stories around how the advent of generative AI is going to just increase the amount of biased information or fake information, or if we're talking about images, deep fakes. I mean, how important or worrying a trend do we think this is? And then the follow-up question would be, how should news organizations think about their strategy to avoid falling for any of this bad information? Is there things that they can do with technology to counter it? Vivian?
I think it's very worrying. It's maybe worrying in a slightly different way than some people think. I'm less worried about the big, spectacular deep fake of, you know, I mean, that happens, but those kinds of things will be debunked really quickly. But in fact, AI is being used today to sort of flood the void of information, and particularly in certain markets, with AI-generated garbage, usually to serve a certain either political or other purpose. There's an organization in the United States called NewsGuard that put out a report a few months ago that showed, you know, local news is declining in the United States. That has showed there are now more what are sometimes called pink slime sites, or sort of garbage sites with a lot of AI-generated content. Usually they're very partisan. There are more of these sort of quasi-fake news sites filling the void in local markets than there are actual legitimate independent news media. That's frightening. The other example is there is a lot, and particularly in the United States with so much attention around the Olympics, there is the flood of sort of bots and garbage that's coming from adversarial nation states is tremendous. So, for example, we're all aware that, you know, Russia, the Internet Research Agency, you know, was first sort of became well known in 2016, that they had hired tens of thousands of people to pretend to be, Americans, to sort of try to inflict all kinds of chaos into the information ecosystem. Now, they can do it at a speed and scale and with fewer resources than possible. And this is happening today.
I would say the way to think about it is the problem is really there's a proliferation of what I call low quality information versus high quality information. So therefore, your trust with your audience become even more valuable, right? And so how do you help the audience discern what's high quality versus low quality? What Gen AI does right now is, I would say deepfake is not something that day-to-day we worry about. There's a term called shadow fakes. That is actually a bigger problem because it's so much faster and so much cheaper now to create imagery and low quality information that is designed to misguide and mislead you, and that's a bigger issue than I would say like the deep fakes. And in terms of how, the responsibility of journalism, again, is really established in that trust, because you can't fact check everything, right? And I think, AI could fact check some stuff, but it couldn't fact check everything. So therefore, it's part of our responsibility to actually educate our audience to basically how do you become more media literate to choose between the high quality information versus low quality information.
Phoebe.
The thing that worries me is not actually misinformation or the proliferation of deepfakes, although all of those things are worrying. I'm worried that we're going to lose the audience's engagement, right? That they're going to say there's so much pink slime, there's so much I just can't trust, or it's not high quality enough, or I do have to fact check everything because I just don't know if it's real anymore. That they just say, never mind, I don't really need to engage with the news that much. And that's the thing that sort of keeps me up at night.
I want to talk a little bit about distribution and go back to this idea of business models and how the industry is shifting a little bit, and really kind of also just get to one of the more pertinent issues around kind of the relationship really between news organizations and publishers and big tech, given everything that we can see that's happening. We can see the trends in search. We can see how journalistic output and distribution still has these dependencies in terms of technology companies and how business models are shifting. The pressures on advertising revenue and again the way that generative AI is ringing through changes. So I really want to dive into what do we think about this, and perhaps Phoebe, you could start with how should news organizations approach this issue of kind of protection of their material, of their IP?
Well, before we get into that, I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, just sort of as we consider sort of this new landscape, right, and this idea that news organizations, I think we previously were thinking about sort of the social media companies, the search companies, and that was sort of who we were negotiating with for audience time or attention or distribution, right? And now we potentially have these sort of AI search experiences or chat experiences, right, that we sort of need to think about. And I think it's really important that we don't make the same mistake that we made with social media, which is that it's not just that we need to sort of negotiate with them around distribution. We need to pay attention to them as a competitor for our audience's attention, right? Not just their dollars, but that, I am a crazy person, so yes, I'm reading the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, right? Like, I'll just go through all those apps. But the usual news consumer is on Instagram, they're WhatsApping with their family, and then they're, maybe cracking open the Washington Post and reading a story, right? And so the expectation around how news is delivered and information is delivered in that context, the audience is going to bring those expectations back to news organizations. And that's the thing we have to sort of step up and be ready to address and think about.
Mm-hmm. Paul, what's your perspective?
So I want us to think a little bit ahead, right? So just to contextualize, when the website first came along, what it does is offer a better alternative than a traditional newspaper bundle, right? I could go to LinkedIn for jobs, I could go to, in the US, I could go to Zillow for real estate, I could go to Yelp for food. I don't need to go to a newspaper. When social media came, is a quick way for me to find these communities that newspaper couldn't offer, right? So in each of these shifts, it took away fundamental ways of how news build communities and develop relationship with communities. When we think about generative AI, what is it they're going to take away from the news industry, right? In some way, the distribution and the production, right? Do you need someone to deliver this finite product? If the AI could deliver news the way you want, if I basically ask ChatGPT or Claude, tell me this story in Yoda language, it will do it, right? So you have to think about what is the product that you're going to produce in the future with this technology. And three things you need to think about, not just AI alone, but AI with more stable Wi-Fi everywhere, and also wearables, right? Like, think about all the information that's being captured by your watch, by your phone. What other wearables gonna come out, and how does that change the way audience consume information? And so you have to think about your news product need to evolve with that. No longer are you just delivering to like a mobile device or a website. Maybe in 10 years, you won't even have a website because search traffic is completely, going to render irrelevant because of AI. So you need to sort of like think ahead.
I just want to make, there is a existential risk here, which, Paul, I'm an optimist in general, and I go around encouraging news organizations to experiment with AI, and yet, this is the nightmare scenario. So the AI organizations are basically scraping either with permission or not with permission, that's getting a little bit harder to do, all of the information from all of the news organizations around the world in every language. So what does that mean? That means when I go to we're not there yet, but if I go to Claude or OpenAI and I say, tell me why was Mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, indicted yesterday? What is he guilty of? For example, this is a big story right now. Rather than going to another shout out to the city who's been breaking a lot of that story or going to another news organization, I'm just going to get that story from OpenAI. Now, all of that information came from hardworking reporters and very expensive newsrooms, and yet in this nightmare scenario, there's no attribution to those news organizations, or if there is, it's something that nobody will ever click through. And so then you're completely undermining what is remaining of the business model for news organizations. That is the nightmare scenario.
With that in mind, how should publications, and obviously this is a big topic, and we can see it played out in negotiations, we can see litigation. How do news organizations go about putting a value on what they're producing?
I think there's two things to value, right? There's sort of your corpus of information, which could be used to train an LLM, right? So that's sort of one value that you can add, where newspapers offer so much context about figures over time, changes of people, geography. It's just like a rich corpus of information. But then, to your point, Vivian, there's also just our ability to keep telling you something new. And I don't think we should underestimate that. Certainly the Post thinks about this, Bloomberg thinks about this, the value of the terminal, of being able to tell you something has moved, something has changed, someone has resigned, there's a new player. That's our real core value as news organizations.
I would say think of your content as data, right? So think about all these companies, what they're training. They're training data based on content. And there was articles basically saying that they're almost done training most of the content they have. So they constantly need new content to train new data. That's where your value is. But how do you think about that value and price it right? So when you negotiate, or my sort of idea, when you talk to the tech companies, you cannot treat them like an average subscriber or average sort of enterprise solution. You have to think about what is it they're doing with your content, and how much is that worth to them and their business? So therefore, you have to right-size sort of the way you negotiate with them, right? Like if I'm paying, $50 for a subscription, they shouldn't be paying $50 for a subscription because I'm not using your content to make derivative product and make money. They are. So you have to think about, how you are helping them make money. So therefore, you need to price your content fundamentally differently when you're talking with these big AI companies.
Thank you. I've got one eye on the clock here, and I think we could continue this conversation for a long time. I do want to throw it open to the audience for any questions that you might have, just for the last few minutes that we have. So why don't we take a couple of questions on the front row.
The mics are coming down.
Oh, here we go. Thank you.
In terms of the audience, the nightmare scenario is not only that AI threatens the business model for smaller newspapers. I'm not talking now about the prestige legacy press, which has a lot of internal protections and resources and all the rest of it. But it's an obvious temptation for smaller newsrooms to make use of low-quality information because they don't have the resources to check it. That's one thing. So it's not just destroying the business model, it's destroying what remains of knowledge authority, which is what social media has also done to us. It undermines knowledge authority. And so it seems to me that AI does contribute to that erosion of knowledge authority below the level of the resourced prestige press and at the level of smaller newsrooms with limited resources. And do you see any counter to that?
I'm actually more of an optimist here, which is, I think in the long run, I mean, this is not a new story. This predates generative AI, the generative AI explosion. There's been a lot of garbage online sites that have come, and sometimes they can get a flash. They're a flash in the pan that can get spikes. But at the end of the day, people are going to stop reading them. And so I don't think that's a road to success, whether you're using AI or you're not using AI. And I also think there is, and I am inspired every day by how many people there are around, in the United States and around the world who are absolutely committed to quality, independent journalism. So I'm less worried about that personally.
I would say if we think of ourselves as the information authority, then we're already losing that battle in some way, right? Because we have to think about how journalism is a service to inform folks. So I would say one example, Outlier Media, which is a nonprofit in Detroit, their primary way of distributing news is through text messaging, but there's a two-way feedback loop, right? So not only do they output the news to the audience, but audience also has a way to contribute to their reporting, right? So I think for smaller places, if you keep that feedback loop between you and your audience, nothing could take away that relationship except yourself. And generative AI could actually enhance that feedback loop much quicker, right? Because they will give you analytical power in ways that you don't have before, like a big place like Washington Post. Because AI could probably analyze basically your feedback loop with audience much quicker if you have a smaller team.
Phoebe, do you want to come in on this? No, let's get another question. Okay, one more question.
Hi. I noticed that some websites, and not only, decided to delete or they blocked the access of all the attacks because they're worried that I will steal their content. I mean, in one Facebook group, which some artists, they deleted they deleted their posts, their pictures, their videos from the internet because they don't want to be trained in AI. What are your thoughts about it? They are overrating or this internet concept that I stealing data from others?
I had a little trouble understanding.
Yes.
Are you asking about news organizations allowing or versus not allowing AI companies to train on their data?
Some websites delete or scrap all the tags because they don't want it to be trained on AI. I mean, do you know, for example, MTV News, we closed, they gave all the tags, they deleted all the tags. A very similar case in the past. The size I took off. And now I know there's some artists are deleting all their the bubble because they didn't want to be trained on data systems. What are your thoughts about that? They are overreacting or the concept that I stealing data from others?
I mean, I just don't think that's an option for news organizations to delete. I think the way that we've sort of engaged with the process of corrections, right? This idea that we don't in very, very rare, like vanishingly rare instances, Vivian, I feel like I want to defer to you to sort of say where these are, but do we ever delete content, right? We're much more likely to correct, to put heavy head note, to say we can no longer substantiate, but there is a real sense that it needs to remain in the public domain. So I think for better or for worse, I don't think content deletion is an option for media.
We are out of time, but I think let's take a couple of minutes for just one more question, if anyone has one. Over here.
Hi.
Hi.
Phoebe said something very important previously. She said that AI is not like social media, and it's quite different, and there are tools, and we can use them and stuff like that. So the thing is that we're not discussing tools against journalists. We're not discussing really zeros and ones against people. We're discussing actually how the big tech is treating journalism. And OpenAI, as well as the other known companies, they're treating journalism exactly the same way they treated us before with their social media tools. That means that they will take everything that they can out of us and give us nothing. So maybe when we discuss all these things, we should be discussing a level up and not a level down, because there's only good to come out of AI using AI tools. The thing is, how will we deal with the big tech, and how will we deal with the media ownership when they will say, well, if AI can do it, well, less well that you do it, then let's use AI because you're too expensive.
So recently, Hacks and Hackers, we did a whole webinar with former Google, Facebook, and Twitter people examining partnership with the news industry. Basically, the comment is, we haven't really learned anything from sort of partnering with tech companies in social media age, because we tend to think about these partnerships as individual organization rather as a collective, as an industry, right? So in the US, there's a reason why the music industry is actually quite powerful, because they work together as a group. And so one of the advice from these former tech executives is, how do we actually talk to tech companies as an industry and not as sort of like, the Spiegel Group having their own deal, and someone else is suing them, and then another group is getting a deal. And the other thing that, again, I would emphasize my earlier point is, we have to understand what is the value of our content in relationship to these companies. We cannot look at the content value as the content for the customer is not the same, because the reader is not looking at the content and making a business out of it. So what is the B2B value, the business-to-business value of our content to these tech companies? Again, we have to rethink that whole way of revenue.
Vivian, last word on this.
Yeah, I just want to make one point. I think we need to be careful not to conflate two things, which maybe has been conflated here. One is the relationship of publishers to the OpenAIs and the big companies. That's one set of issues. But here's where AI is different than social media, because social media is only an external platform that can drive traffic or take traffic or what have you. But in addition to that, separately, AI is a set of tools, a set of technologies that, despite what they may like you to believe, the big AI companies don't own the concept of AI and all those tools. And there are plenty of tools that news organizations can and are, you heard examples today, using to better serve their audience. So what you described is an issue, but it is not the only thing.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone in the audience. Thank you to IMED for having us. Thanks, Vivian, Phoebe, and Paul. And enjoy the rest of today.